Welcome to all. America, and led by it, the world, has been at war with the truth as America's longest war, the armed conflict of 20 years, was fought with the Taliban. The Washington papers, an investigative report by the Washington Post, reveal that the US political leaders and army generals did not tell the truth about the war in Afghanistan for at least over 15 years and made statements that they knew were false, denying evidence that the war showed signs of being unwinnable. We gather today to hear from two global experts to learn the truth about the long war and what follows. Before introducing our speakers, I want to address some housekeeping items. First, our speakers have expressed interest in devoting adequate time to the discussion and the Q&A period. Each speaker will thus speak for 15 to 20 minutes, after which we will move to discussions. To organize the discussion period well, I request the audience to type the questions they have in the Q&A box, not in the chat box, indicating to whom the question is directed. Then, during the discussion period, I will read out each question, mentioning who should respond and let the panelists answer. I will now introduce the speakers of this session. Peggy Mason is currently the president of the Ottawa-based well-known think tank, Rideau Institute. She has been in this position since 2014. She served as the Canadian ambassador for disarmament to the UN and as the senior advisor to Afghanistan Pathways to Peace, a civil society project. Our keynote speaker, Omar Samad, is long known to Canadians as Afghanistan's first ambassador to Canada in the first decade of this century, when Afghanistan had a high profile in Canada's foreign policy. Mr. Samad, thereafter served as Afghanistan's ambassador to France. In more recent years, he served as the senior advisor to Afghanistan government CEO and chairman of the High Council for National Reconciliation, Dr. Abdullah. I request Peggy Mason to speak first. I welcome you, Peggy.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this most timely discussion on Afghanistan. Neepa Banerjee and I first met at a parliamentary committee looking into UN peacekeeping, and it was an online Globe and Mail question and answer session in 2006 that first brought Ambassador Samad and I together. I have been preoccupied with Afghanistan since the September 11th Twin Tower and Pentagon attacks, when I began speaking out in the media and writing about the need for a rule of law, policing-led solution to those terrible attacks, as well as attention to underlying grievances that violent extremists exploit for their own ends. This approach was unanimously endorsed by the UN Security Council at the time in two resolutions passed on 28 September and 12 November 2001, respectively. But as we all know, this was not the route that the United States followed, choosing war instead. After the US-led invasion of Afghanistan in late 2001, I consistently argued for a comprehensive UN-facilitated peace process, encompassing not only all the internal Afghan parties to the conflict, including the Taliban, but the regional and other actors implicated in the conflict, as the only way to address all outstanding issues, including in particular, Pakistan's support for militant extremists, driven as it was by its own security concerns with India. From 2006 to 2013, I was involved in multiple training exercises with NATO forces readying to deploy to Afghanistan, and saw up close what commanders really thought of how NATO's counterinsurgency campaign was going. Yet the information, as Nipa said in her introduction, provided to the public continued to paint a false picture that things were getting better, not steadily worse. I testified before the Manley Commission in 2008 as follows, and I quote, "The Canadian mantra is no development without security, and no security without development. Yet the truth is that there can be neither security nor development without an end to the war, and that cannot happen by military means. The only solution is a negotiated settlement." Celebrated Canadian peace researcher, internal security policy expert, and Order of Canada member Ernie Regier, in his 2015 book, Disarming Conflict, Why Peace Cannot Be Won on the Battlefield, wrote, and I quote, "Wars fought over the past quarter century have been a spectacular failure. The overwhelming majority end in military stalemate and are settled at the negotiating table, with the grievances that led to the war still unresolved. Force cannot simply override or transcend the social, political, and economic realities of conflict." And elsewhere in the book, he notes that of the minority of conflicts ostensibly ended on the battlefield, the insurgents are just as likely to prevail as the governments they are fighting. Yet, the US and its NATO allies steadfastly refused, no matter how much the situation deteriorated, to countenance a diplomatic peacemaking approach. Let us consider the 2008 Manley Report, the only attempt to date by the Canadian government to assess the merits of the Western strategy in Afghanistan. Its refreshing honesty about the security situation and its grudging acknowledgement of the need for, quote, an eventual political reconciliation seemed promising, as was its analysis of the complicated regional geopolitics and role of regional actors in perpetuating the conflict. But incredibly, the only solution offered was better coordination of the existing failing military-centric strategy, greater diplomatic pressure on Pakistan to end its Taliban support without any effort to address the concerns driving its actions, and an increase of 1,000 additional soldiers from other NATO countries as the key determinants for continued Canadian participation in the quagmire, as we did with Parliament's blessing. My most direct involvement with civil society in Afghanistan, again, as Nipa noted in the introduction, was as a senior advisor to the Afghanistan Pathways to Peace project, which undertook research with the University of Kabul in every Afghan province and worked with civil society organizations in Afghanistan on promoting a comprehensive peace process, including the holding of 2 conferences in Kabul in 2010. The first of which I attended, and the second of which, excuse me, a medical emergency prevented me from attending. We engaged with a huge range of Afghans from all around the country, and the most frequent question posed to us was why the international community was backing a government that included infamous warlords like Abdul Rashid Dostum, with decades of innocent blood on their hands. More on that in a moment. Afghanistan was not my first experience with promoting negotiations over war fighting. One of my main areas of focus throughout my career has been UN-facilitated conflict resolution negotiation processes and the role that UN peacekeeping plays in the implementation of peace agreements. The UN has made many mistakes in these efforts, but has steadily learned from them, with the result that UN peacekeeping offers war-afflicted countries the best chance at building a sustainable peace. The US and NATO in Afghanistan made no effort to benefit from these hard-won lessons, but instead proceeded to repeat every possible mistake and more. To run down a few, there was no peace process at all, let alone an inclusive one. The UN's role was restricted to humanitarian assistance, broadened to include elections, but with vital institution building roles parceled out to individual so-called lead nations who were utterly unequipped for these tasks. The UK took the lead on poppy eradication. Look how that turned out. Germany on police training, Italy on reform of the judiciary, and Japan on disarmament of ex-combatants. All of these countries had something to contribute in these areas, but none had the UN institutional capacity and experience to lead the effort. An absurdly centralized constitutional arrangement drafted in Washington was imposed on one of the world's most decentralized countries. And unforgivably, aid was militarized through the creation of US-inspired provincial reconstruction teams, which polluted aid and development plans with counterinsurgency campaigns to win hearts and minds, undermining good governance efforts and putting at risk the aid workers and ordinary Afghans they were trying to help alike. And the subordination of good government to the counterinsurgency campaign was, of course, the reason why the Western-backed Afghan governments of Hamid Karzai and Ashraf Ghani included notorious warlords and their oh-so-useful militias. I have structured my opening remarks in this way, not only to give an indication of where my work in relation to Afghanistan, but also to vividly demonstrate that where we find ourselves now need not have been so. Afghanistan is not a failure of genuine post-conflict peace building or nation building, to use the American term that is the polar opposite of what they actually did. It is a manifest failure of trying to build the peace on the battlefield. Our webinar title asks, so now what? Before we can begin to answer that very difficult question, we need to honestly face up to the state of Afghanistan after 20 years of US-led Western intervention. Consider these sobering facts. Afghanistan is one of the most foreign aid dependents in the countries in the world. This is all pre-Taliban takeover statistics I'm talking about. 40% of its GDP from foreign aid, 75% of its pre-Taliban takeover budget. After 20 years of Western-led intervention, almost 50% of the Afghan population lives in poverty. Before the takeover, Afghanistan was in the midst of multiple humanitarian crises brought on by drought, the pandemic, and displacement due to conflict, all of which have now been greatly exacerbated by the freezing of foreign assets and withholding of IMF and World Bank funds, as well as development funds from major donors like the EU. The international community is rightly demanding that the Taliban should establish an inclusive government, but this was precisely what the international community denied Afghanistan in the Bonn Agreement of 2001, excluding as it did representatives of the defeated Taliban. A word about the important gains made by women in Afghanistan. Yes, extremely important advances in education, labor rights, and participation in Afghan society broadly were made. But for the vast majority of Afghan women in rural areas where the counterinsurgency raged, their reality was a daily struggle simply to survive. Against this grim backdrop, the West should bring a large degree of humility to its efforts to develop what the EU now calls operational engagement with the Taliban. And this is the message I hope our audience, which I know is very active on these issues, takes to government. The primary objective must surely be the prevention of even greater suffering for the Afghan people, the majority of which are not going to be leaving the country. However worthwhile those endeavors by various countries like Canada are to help the most vulnerable. First and foremost, that means meeting immediate, urgent humanitarian refugee agency needs, and Canada seems to be stepping up in that regard, as is the international community more broadly, in response to the UN's latest flash appeal. However, the World Bank also needs to immediately unfreeze funds for projects, many of them hospitals, that are administered by NGOs, not the government of Afghanistan. Beyond this, we come to the hard part, the politics, the fundamental issue of the terms of engagement with the Taliban. And in particular, as the International Crisis Group has recently put it, whether there is any set of policies and practices the Taliban might plausibly implement that could meet conditions for recognition, sanctions lifting, and potential support from donors and international institutions. Bearing in mind, this is the kicker. This is the kicker with all of the ultimatums being lobbed at the Taliban. The potential consequences of a deeply impoverished and isolated Taliban-run state, starved of external resources and recognition and struggling to provide basic resources. In addition to the Taliban honoring their pledge to prevent Afghanistan becoming a haven for terrorism, two key demands now being put forward by the international community and in respect of which the Taliban political leadership has made promises yet to be fulfilled are an inclusive government and respect for fundamental rights, including the rights of women and girls to education and participation in the labor force. The US, not having included these conditions in the negotiations on its withdrawal of troops and having withdrawn those troops, has now championed these demands. The G7 has pledged to hold the Taliban accountable for their actions in meeting these pledges. Canada has sent a former Canadian ambassador to Afghanistan as a special envoy to Doha to engage with regional allies and partners and to participate in the ongoing Qatari-facilitated political talks with which Ambassador Samed has been directly involved and hopefully will tell us more. But the critical question remains how to hold the Taliban accountable for their promises without harming further the Afghan people and increasing, not decreasing, instability in the country to the benefit only of terrorist groups. This question is doubly difficult if one considers the makeup of the Taliban itself, which can broadly speaking be divided between a sophisticated political leadership on the one hand and the military commanders and rank and file fighters who won the war and are in control on the ground on the other. What differences in intention might there be between the two groups? And is the leadership willing? And if it is willing, is it able to overcome these differences, particularly in relation to an inclusive government and the rights of women? Here at home, the Canadian government and all opposition parties have a key role to play in muting the fevered anti-Taliban rhetoric we saw during the frantic Kabul airport evacuation process. The government needs to articulate that our objectives must be helping the Afghanistan people and preventing a destabilized Afghanistan. And that in turn means working with the international community to find a constructive basis for engaging with the Taliban on the basis of realistic demands and timelines, however difficult that might be. This is the essence of diplomacy, not talking to your friends, but finding accommodation with those with polar opposite views. Certainly, none of this will be easy. We need smart, patient diplomacy that is clear-eyed about the goal of helping the Afghan people to the maximum extent possible and avoiding a worst-case scenario of a tyrannical, isolated Islamist state that is a haven for terrorists and within which not just the Taliban government, but the Afghan people are entirely impoverished. I will end where I started, a comprehensive peace process. Qatar is trying to bring in as many regional players as possible because the regional dimension remains as complicated as ever and is vital to a stable, workable Afghanistan going forward. And that also means the UN oversight and peace facilitation role needs to be championed and strengthened. I stop there. I look forward very much to the remarks by Ambassador Samed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peggy. All that I can say is wow. And I hope that, within this very short time, what she has said for the war over 20 years, I, with my own experience, maybe not as much as that of Peggy, I have found all of these things. And let's wait for Ambassador Samad now to speak. I request the audience to type up their questions to Peggy now, and we will move to that after during the discussion period. May I welcome you, Ambassador Samad.
Well, thank you so much, Nipa Banerjee. I'm delighted to be here with you today. I'm delighted to reconnect with you and with Ambassador Peggy Mason. Both of you have served your country with honor and distinction, and I have fond memories of not only my time in Canada, but also of my work with all Canadians who engaged with Afghanistan during those critical years. Merci beaucoup pour cette invitation et pour cette discussion sur l'Afghanistan, un pays que beaucoup de Canadiens connaissent bien. I know that Ambassador Mason covered a lot of critical issues about the past 20 years. I agree with her on many of those counts, having learned many lessons along the way, from my days as an ambassador to my days as an advisor and as a consultant, and even nowadays with the Atlantic Council as a non-resident senior fellow. I, as an Afghan who have dealt with my country's issues for, I would say, 43 years, more or less, I'm still learning, and I do not pretend for a minute to know enough or to have the answers to most of the questions that were raised. Yes, it became a quagmire, and yes, we lost hearts and minds, and yes, it was militarized beyond the need. Things could have turned around at a certain point. We should have known better. We should have understood better. There are lots of lessons. We can talk about the last 20 years infinitum, but for the next few minutes that you have given me this time, I want to focus mostly on now, what happened in the last month or two, and what the prospects are. I think that is very important for us as I address the 20-year-long war and the international effort to stabilize and rebuild Afghanistan. And later on, I hope to have other issues and topics come up in the Q&A, Nipa, and other questions that you may have. Last month's abrupt takeover of Kabul on August 15th obviously bewildered millions of Afghans, many of whom did not see it coming, and sent shockwaves across the region and the world as a Western-backed government and recipient of more than, and we can play with the figures, but in my estimates, about $200 billion worth of direct aid over the last 20 years. And I'm not counting the latest figures that were given by Brown University that says the post 9/11 total expenditures of war on terrorism, all these different theaters, Iraq, Syria, and others, has cost $14 trillion, trillion with a T, and half of which have gone to contractors. But in any way, what we did was we endowed Afghanistan with what we thought was a modernized military force of more than 300,000, at least on paper, a force that lost control of Afghanistan's cities and towns and villages within 11 days without much fighting or resistance as the Taliban swept across the country. While the media, as we all remember a few days ago, and public attention was drawn to the ensuing chaos at Kabul International Airport, when a mix of officials, fleeing elites, civil society activists, translators, even spies and ex-regime henchmen, and opportunists and people, average people off the street, tried to jump the walls and catch the first flight out with or without proper paperwork. The real story of how the regime fell, the strategic shifts and what a Taliban takeover means, was relegated to page 2. Even though there are different unfounded theories as to how and why, whether there was a secret deal involving, let's say, the former ruler, Ashraf Ghani, maybe a Taliban faction, or even external accomplices, I am pretty sure that sooner or later the real plot involving a handful of individuals will be revealed. Ashraf Ghani provided an incredulous explanation a few days ago, but at this stage, no one really buys that fictional story. What we do know, however, from several credible Afghan sources, people involved in peacemaking and negotiations in Doha and in Kabul, both Afghan and non-Afghan and diplomats, is that after almost 2 years of trying and not succeeding because of political pushback by supporters of the Kabul regime, who on several occasions scuttled a political settlement, an ultimatum was finally given by the Taliban in early August. So the timelines are very important. And that ultimatum was given during Dr. Abdullah's last visit to Doha, that short of a military takeover, a power sharing arrangement was possible at the time, as long as President Ghani stepped down as part of a 2-week-long transition process. All sides met in Kabul. They had long discussions on August 11, 12, 13, and they agreed that Ashraf Ghani, including Ashraf Ghani, verbally agreed to step down and pave the way for a transitional interim government, which would have prevented a Taliban military takeover, even though the Taliban had by then gained influence over much of the country. So all sides agreed, but then on August 15th, Mr. Ghani scuttled the arrangement by fleeing without giving notice or paving the way for peaceful transition. This final act created a sudden power vacuum in Kabul, and the Taliban, who were on the outskirts, actually called on the Americans. Now we know military and diplomatic representatives of America to step in and take responsibility for the security of Kabul on August 15th. But according to these sources, the Americans did not accept because they were on their way out, not on their way back in. And the Taliban at that point had their own internal discussions and decided that they would walk into Kabul and take over. There was no fighting. Kabul, like many other cities, was taken with almost no fighting. Since then, the evacuation and after the evacuation saga that lasted several weeks, attention has shifted to now Taliban behavior, whether they're version 1 of the 1990s or version 2 of the current times. And also it has shifted on how to deal with the imminent catastrophic humanitarian disaster inherited by the Taliban and unfortunately worsened by Western decisions to withhold crucial funding and freeze Afghan financial assets. The only exception for now being emergency relief and aid and going through international intermediaries to mitigate a disaster. And as we speak, the United Nations is getting more involved. Some experienced NGOs are getting involved again to make sure that we do not cross that line into a catastrophe. Salaries, unfortunately, are not being paid, and the economy is at a standstill. A panic is slowly setting in. A dependent, as Peggy Mason mentioned, a very dependent and war-afflicted country for the past 43 years has now had almost all its feeding tubes cut by the same donors who were funding a corrupt and ineffective government to the tune of, on average, $10 to $15 billion a year until August 15th. The other preoccupation is whether the Taliban will allow other political and social groupings to be part of a broad-based government, or whether they will appoint qualified women in government positions. So far, they have stuck to their own kind, showing little interest in sharing power. That decision and the other about delaying female students above grade 6 from going back to school or college have created deep concerns inside and outside Afghanistan about the Taliban ability to overcome unfounded rigidity and extreme tendencies. One explanation, which has yet to be tested, is that internal factionalism and concerns about cohesion may be key drivers of these behaviors. A problem since the 1990s is that the Taliban are not transparent, and that to this day, we really do not know enough about the inner workings. As an example, a few days ago, we heard that the number 2 of the Taliban movement, Mullah Baradar, who had been negotiating in Doha all this time, was sidelined, or that something happened in Kabul, and that 2 factions disagreed on some key policy issues. We do not know what those issues were. And Mullah Baradar disappeared for almost 2 weeks. But today, just an hour or 2 ago, I saw a news clip showing him back in Kabul, meeting with a Central Asian delegation. Si l'on replace ces événements dans leur contexte historique, l'Afghanistan connaît ainsi son 9e bouleversement politique majeur au cours des 48 dernières années. Peu de pays dans l'histoire du monde ont enduré de telles turbulences accompagnées de plus de 40 ans de guerre, de souffrance humaine et de déplacement. The flip side of this latest turnover is that the guns of war have quieted in almost 99% of the country. And there are no more bombs falling on Afghan villages, and there are no more suicide bombers from whichever quarter attacking Afghans in their homes, in their markets, in their schools, in their clinics. Although there are disturbing reports of revenge killings and communal harassment in specific areas of the country, the overall casualty rate from war has gone down from an average of 150 deaths per day, and at times it went up to 250 deaths per day, to now single digits. The main security threats at this stage are either originating from sporadic terrorist attacks from groups such as Daesh KP or ISKP, or in the form of remote, small-scale insurgency in the Hindu Kush mountains near Panjshir Valley in the central regions. The other novelty after 43 years is that one group, one ruling faction, is now in control of the country's administrative centers. Although there are apparent internal issues, as we discussed, and modern governance is not their forte, we are also seeing a population move away from the cities in large urban centers back to the villages in smaller towns. Why? Because inflation is kicked in, because there's unemployment, because they cannot afford food and rent, and livelihoods have become scarce. The Taliban are facing several challenges, chief among them. One, a legitimacy quandary, as the world exerts pressure on Taliban and makes demands that the Taliban are defined. Number 2, governance and technocratic weaknesses that the Taliban have, as we've seen in their appointments. Number 3, in terms of service delivery in a society facing a huge humanitarian crisis. And number 4, inaccessibility to cash and international financial constraints. In return, the donors, with few exceptions in the region maybe, are demanding, 1, that the Taliban share power and include representatives of other ethnic groups, women, and technocrats. 2, that they adhere to international human rights and gender rights norms. And 3, that they fight terrorism with all its different forms and styles, and groups deemed as a security threat not only to Western nations, but also others in the regions like the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians, and et cetera, et cetera. Thus far, the Taliban have shown some level of tolerance, for example, for media freedoms, for women still appearing on TV, or a few of them going to work, although we know that some journalists have been abused. They announced a partial caretaker government a couple of weeks ago, made up mostly of old guard and a few token ethnic representatives a few days ago, while promising to include other figures. But we haven't seen anything in that regard happen yet. They've also not come up with a plan to allow girls to attend high school or universities, pledging to come up with a new segregated system first. Only a few women, as I mentioned, are allowed to go to work, and none have been appointed to new positions. So while there are signs that the Taliban have internal disagreements over policy, there are also indications that a soft power struggle is underway. The Haqqani faction, for example, a powerful faction within the Taliban ruling Shura, took advantage of the vacuum created by Ashraf Ghani on October 15th and entered the capital, as I mentioned earlier, before other forces were able to join them from other parts of Afghanistan, especially from southern Afghanistan. While the Taliban are not paying too much attention to Western demands at this point, the UN and some NGOs have been allowed to return to the country to assist in the humanitarian effort underway after more than $1.2 billion were pledged at a Geneva conference a few days ago. Preventing Afghanistan from reaching a 90% plus poverty rate at this point should be a top priority, because we may have been around the 50 to 60% poverty range before the fall of Kabul, but at this stage, if the assessments are correct, and if the aid doesn't reach Afghans, we are going to move to a 90 to 95% poverty range, which could be catastrophic for any society. And there are no societies in the world that have actually reached those disastrous levels. Let me say a few things about regional relations that Peggy also alluded to that are very critical. Regional relations, meaning neighborhood relations, seem to be of more importance to the new Kabul rulers than engaging Western traditional donors at this stage. They have their own calculations, and they have also, as we all know, built up those relationships over the past few years, especially with Russia, China, and Iran. Pakistan has always been obviously on their side and has been a base for the Taliban, as was mentioned earlier. So aside from the long-standing ties with Pakistan, they have also invested, as I said, with those countries, but also in the past few days, we see Qatar, Turkey, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and even Tajikistan to some extent show outreach to the Taliban and vice versa. And today, as I mentioned earlier, a Kazakhstan delegation is in Kabul meeting with Taliban leaders. Tajikistan obviously has its own controversies because of the connections to the Panjshir Valley, to the Tajiks of Afghanistan, and to this mini resistance that is said to be still alive. We don't exactly not sure what is happening to that resistance at this point, as some of their leaders have fled. But there is something going on still in that region. And I think that Tajikistan is taking sort of a middle of the road approach, as all the other neighbors are aiming to coordinate their efforts vis-a-vis a collective recognition of the new regime, or waiting and seeing what happens in Kabul. A few days ago, the Shanghai Security Conference, the SCO, issued similar signals, somewhat mixed, but in line with what I just said, and not being adverse to formal recognition of the new regime under more flexible conditions. The Chinese have been visiting the Taliban, the ambassador in Kabul, and there are several regional embassies that are still open in Kabul, and none of the Western country embassies have yet opened. There's talk of maybe one or two opening up, or maybe a liaison office, but the Western countries and they are doing most of their work through Doha still. The United Nations has returned to Kabul. There are UN offices that are opening up again, especially those involved with humanitarian assistance. Now, as Daesh KP or ISKP, the affiliate, the regional affiliate in Afghanistan, aims to disrupt security, and we've seen some incidents happen in eastern Afghanistan in the past few days. And anti-Taliban forces, as I mentioned, in the Panjshir and other parts, who lost most of their territories after the two sides, the Panjshir side and the Taliban side, could not agree on a political arrangement before the Taliban entered the Panjshir. The next few weeks, in my opinion, will be a major test of, on one hand, Taliban cohesion, policy flexibility, and foreign engagement as the country deals with a looming humanitarian crisis and frozen assets. It will also be a test, and I will end with this here, about Taliban's ability to learn from the past and understand its own pluralistic society. Back to you, Nipa.
Thank you very much for this very illuminating presentation and your insights as an Afghan close to the government, what you have told us. Thank you for this. Without much delay, we will now open the question package. And I think it would be a good idea to start the discussion after this without me making any interventions at this time. I might later, but I see that I very much agree with both speakers. Peggy's analysis of the last 20 years, what was going on, and hers, as well as Omar's position on how the international community could work now. As a development person, I'm mostly interested in the situation, the economic situation that the Afghans are in now. I think the latest statistics I saw was 97% of the people are under the poverty line, which is absolutely, I mean, I have not seen it in any other countries that I have worked in. And it is, UN calls it universal poverty. That's a matter of concern. Some of the young Afghan friends that I worked with before, when they talk, they very much share the views that Afghanistan needs help. And despite some concerns about the Taliban not respecting human rights, etc., they feel that there are possibilities of Taliban turning around, of the government people turning around and helping. In any case, they feel that without the international community's help, it would be very difficult. And maybe later on, both of you could comment on the Taliban interest in getting international recognition because they want now to attend the General Assembly meeting of the UN, and also, and they want to send a representative. What is, I don't know what, perhaps both Peggy and Omar might have some reflections on that subject, and what we could gain from the Taliban attending the General Assembly meeting, etc. I will now open the questions package, and well, I guess I will find the first few with Peggy and then followed by Omar. So we hope to hear more from you. Okay. Question to Peggy. I mean, are these answered already? I wonder about it.
No, Nipa, the first two questions to me, which are the same question, are not answered. So I wonder if I could just read out those myself and answer, because
Yes,
you've
I
led,
think it's a
you've
good
given
idea.
an intro.
Yeah.
You yourself have actually given us a very good intro to those two questions. The first one reads, what do you think about the Taliban's demand to take over the Afghan UN seat? And then the elaboration of that question is, what do you think about the Taliban's representation at the United Nations? Should the UN keep them on the waiting list until they behave like a mature and responsible government, or accept their application in order to keep them engaged? Now, those two alternatives sum up in a nutshell the dilemma that the international community is facing. You know, how all or nothing is clearly not what we want. We want a constructive engagement. And so this means that it's actually a committee. There's a UN credentials committee, which has the task of determining, allegedly on a very technical basis, whether or not the de facto Taliban government qualifies as the legitimate recognized government of Afghanistan. So there's this committee that's going to be going through this, and it's not expected that they will make their decision before the end of the high level part of the General Assembly. So it's technically possible that they can make a decision in time for the Taliban to speak, but absent some kind of movement beyond where we're at right now, where you've got conditions, the international community wanting certain conditions to be met, and the Taliban not in a position or not yet willing to do them. It's possible that the Credentials Committee may just drag it out. I mean, they have to look at things like, are they de facto in control, but they also have to look at how they came into that control, because taking over a government by force is not normally the way that one gets a UN seat, a seat at the UN. So they're going to want to look at things like the position of other governments in terms of recognition. And the UN Security Council was actually supposed to meet to discuss Afghanistan yesterday. And we haven't heard, I haven't seen any reporting out yet, but that would be a topic. So in other words, there's no, like the bigger question of how do we engage with the Taliban going forward, so that we avoid the worst case and try and help the situation. That in essence is part of what the UN is going to be grappling with right now with respect to the recognition of the Taliban. And I guess I will jump in. I suppose I'll jump in right now on what I think is where I would like. I mean, I would certainly like Omar's view on this, and anyone in the audience and who wants to chime in. But this problem that Omar has identified, has crystallized, of the lack of capacity, technocratic, administrative capacity, understandably, of the Taliban as a government, and their internal lack of cohesion, and therefore their overriding concern to maintain cohesion. That's a terrible, terrible combination for making important steps forward. And so it seems to me that the international community has to look at realistic expectations and timelines, and they have to try and move on a step-by-step basis of engagement with the Taliban, to give them time to get themselves organized, to give them incentives to be able to live up to those conditions. And so I'll stop there with that on that question.
Stephen Barani's question.
Oh, you want me to go to Stephen's question? Okay, so Stephen Barani. Okay, well, Stephen's Barani says, do we know anything about Global Affairs Canada or the Prime Minister's office opening to my recommendations about this pragmatic, constructive approach? And the short answer is no, we don't. I don't at this stage, no. I mean, I'm very encouraged by the fact that they sent, a seasoned diplomat. We don't have that many left to Doha, because that's where the action is. And I take great heart from the Qatari belief in multilateralism and very, very strong links with the UN. Because if the Doha talks are going to really, and it's wonderful that the regional players are there, there's a common interest among the West and the regional players in security, in Afghanistan not descending into a haven for terrorists. So bringing the UN oversight and bringing the UN role more broadly into the Doha talks, I think is an elaboration of what I think Canada should be pushing for. But I do take heart by the fact that we've understood the importance of Doha. And I also, Stephen Granier in his question says, if the government isn't open to these recommendations, how can parties holding the balance of power like the NDP push for a more nuanced approach? And of course, we have to, hopefully we can convince the NDP, because of course, during the election, they were all engaged in the Taliban are terrorists. This is bad. They're on the terrorist list. Don't talk to them. I mean, an election campaign is the worst possible time to be arguing for a nuanced position on anything. I'm hopeful now that we're out of the election fever and we're back into, and the situation of Afghanistan is becoming clearer, hopefully, or can be made more clear, that it's not a black and white situation, that the West is not in a position where it can say, Taliban, you do this or else, because the or else is catastrophic for everyone involved, not just the Taliban. And so I'm counting on, as I said earlier, that participants in this discussion will get that message across to all of their interlocutors inside government and outside in think tanks, and also, frankly, to the media. I'll stop there.
I see there are questions by Saeed Mirzai, and the question is to Ambassador Samad. You want to read out your question, Omar, and
go
then
ahead. You can
respond.
Okay. I saw it briefly. I think it's about the past and how Afghans defeated the British and defeated the USSR and the failure of the US. What message are you sending to the international community? And how should the international community respond to the situation in Afghanistan? Before I get to that, let me just add to what Peggy correctly said about the UN recognition and the sanctions and the Credentials Committee work. We don't know exactly if the Credentials Committee is going to meet, when they're going to meet, and whether they're going to have a decision on the Taliban request during this UN General Assembly period. So we don't know. But what we do know is that Germany has come out against recognition at this point, but they're not part of the committee. I think the US, China, and Russia are, and a few other countries. And there's also another issue for the Taliban that they have to overcome, and for the Credentials Committee, and that is the decisions that the Sanctions Committee has taken about the Taliban. The Taliban are sort of on a black list as of a few years ago, both in terms of their affiliations to certain terrorist groups, as well as their cooperation in some ways with counterterrorism. And there are some individuals, Taliban leaders, who now are actually ministers who are on those lists. And I think any type of recognition, official recognition, would need to take care of that first. It would be somewhat illogical to do that and leave the other on. And so the Afghanistan seat at the UN is right now occupied by the representative of Ashraf Ghani, who was sent there just a few months ago. it's going to be interesting to see if he will be allowed to speak or whether both, there's a possibility that both representatives would be allowed to speak. We don't know. But it is going to be important because recognition for the Taliban is of utmost importance at this stage now that they can claim control of almost 100% of the country. There are two ways to get recognized. One is the UN, which obviously is an important signal to the rest of the international community. The other is bilateral, and each country would decide for itself, or a block of countries would decide for themselves, as is now the case with Afghanistan. I think you're going to see blocks of countries down the road deciding on whether to recognize the Taliban as a legitimate government or not. You will probably also see regional countries maybe quicker and more amenable and more interested for their own reasons, just because they're in the neighborhood and they have their own set of issues about Afghanistan that they need to deal with a government in Kabul. So there's a very practical side to this in terms of counterterrorism, in terms of refugees, in terms of drugs, in terms of a host of bilateral issues that bind Afghanistan to its neighbors. So you might see some traction on that side sooner rather than later. As far as the question by our friend, well, yes, Afghanistan in the 19th century, early 20th century had a British colonial problem. It was never colonized fully, but at some stage, its foreign policy was subject to British dictate until 1919, when it regained its independence after the Third Anglo-Afghan War, which were small wars compared to what we've seen in the past 43 years, with little casualties, but a victim of back then imperial rivalries, Russian imperial rivalries, British, and others like the Persians and the Turks and others. With the Soviets during the Cold War, the last chapter of the Cold War was Afghanistan. And the battlefield, the hot battlefield of the Cold War was Afghanistan. And that was because of, I think, an internal Afghan problem where an Afghan communist regime or Afghan communist factions and parties disrupted the natural development of political growth in the country and staged a bloody military coup, first in 1973 to some extent through a rebellious prince, and then in 1970.
His microphone has gone off.
Yeah.
Mute. Okay, it's on again.
So did you miss something that I said?
Yeah, just the last, I think.
Okay, so the 1973, 1978 communist Afghans who were aided by the Soviets, and then 1979, the Soviet invasion. But I do remember very clearly that the day after the 78 coup, there was already resistance to the communist coup. I saw it in the city with students and anyone who thought it was a bad thing that had happened. And they were right. And in the rural countryside, people picked up arms against the communist takeover. And when the Soviets invaded, the whole country, the non-regime country, took up arms. And 1.5 million Afghans died in that war. It was devastating. That was the beginning. So, Afghanistan never recovered from different episodes of instability and war during that period, then during the Mujahideen period, then during the Taliban period. And then with the arrival of the Americans and NATO, including Canadians, we thought that we were going to put behind us everything that went wrong in the past 2 decades. I was one of the very first Afghans to actually decide to go back and help rebuild the country and help with what in any way I could. I was in Kabul in December of 2001, not knowing what exactly I was going to do, but I knew all the players and I was there enthusiastically trying to help. Ended up with the foreign ministry. So it was a different intervention. It was accepted and understood by everyone that post 9/11, something had to be done. Now, yes, it could have been done differently. We can argue about the different choices that existed all day long. But what happened could have been managed better down the road. So what we ended up was with weak leadership, I think weak management, I think the militarization of the whole project, it became sort of a money-making cash cow, and we started spinning wheels. I call it the spinning wheel syndrome. After a few years of trying to put the country back on its feet, we got entangled in this quagmire, as was called earlier, that really didn't produce anything anymore, didn't have any traction. It was just a lot of talk, it was a lot of noise, a lot of pretending that we do this and that, a lot of pretending that we still need to go after the terrorists and the insurgents. And eventually the insurgent and the terrorist ended up being the Afghan villager. And the people who, for one reason or another, were victimized. Yes, there was a terrorist threat, of course. How on earth is it possible that after 20 years, trillions of dollars of expenditure, the best technologies in the world, we are still now wondering whether Al-Qaeda is a threat in Afghanistan or not? How on earth is that possible? It is because it became a spinning wheel syndrome. And in the name of democracy, which I supported fully and I still do, in the name of human rights, which I supported fully and still do, under those slogans, we actually undermined democracy. We actually undermined human rights because we went after the Afghan villager. Yes, Peggy's right. 95% of Afghan women became victims of the women's rights movement, who only were concerned about a few women in Kabul or in the big cities. Yes, okay, we helped those women. We trained them, we gave them education. They gained capacities. But what about the rest? What about the 95% who were afraid of being droned every day and whose sons and brothers and husbands and fathers were taken away for no reason? In some cases, for no reason. So this war lost its objective and its meaning and direction and strategy and vision. It lost all of that. And it lasted for 20 years. It should have ended much sooner. We should have gone for a political settlement. I told you earlier that even a week before the fall of Kabul, we had a chance for a political settlement. But a certain group, a certain interest group, a certain clique, whatever you want to call it, did everything possible to prevent that from happening at the cost of fleeing the country irresponsibly, leaving a nation stranded, and not allowing for that little chance of a political settlement and a negotiated settlement to take place. I, for the past few years, through the media, through my analysis, and through my recommendations to political leaders, have on many occasions said, you need to take advantage of this opportunity, whether it's good or bad, whether the deal between the US and the Taliban is good or bad. The US has made a decision to leave for their own reasons, good or bad. We Afghans need to understand that one day that is going to happen sooner or later. And when that happens, there is a chance. There are two options. Either the Taliban will take the whole cake, or we aim for a political settlement beforehand and share power and have a sort of middle of the road solution. But There were forces that prevented that middle of the road solution for their own egotistical reasons, bad policy, bad strategy, and played every game and every trick in the toolbox in order to prevent a solution to occur. So anyway, so when we talk about the American experience, they meant well, like the Canadians, like the Europeans, like the Japanese, like many others. They all meant well. There's goodwill. I saw that in my missions. The people of Canada wanted to help. They understood that it meant something. And the taxpayers of Canada paid for it. There were some who opposed it, but that's a democracy. And we were thankful. But how we did it, what we produced, what legacy we left behind is something that for many, many years to come, people will study and do research and write about. And the American experience, obviously, was the biggest, largest contributor because it involved, as I told you, hundreds of billions of dollars and over 2,500 American lives. Plus, do not forget, about 3,500 lives of contractors that people fail to mention. So in total, about 6,000 Americans and others, plus closer to 7,000 if you count everybody else, paid the ultimate price in Afghanistan. How many Afghans have died? Anybody's guess? My guess is about close to 200,000 Afghans paid the ultimate price. I don't know how many people on the Taliban side died. I don't know how many civilians on the Taliban side died. Nobody knows. But the price was very high. So this war had to end, and the American experience had to end at some point. The way it did, yes, it could have been different, but there were fewer and fewer choices left at the end of the day.
Thanks very much, Omar. We have a large number of questions, and they are very interesting. I was wondering if I could sort of summarize two trends as I see in the questions, and perhaps I could request Omar and Peggy both to comment. We have time until 12:30, but the questions we have and the answers to them could take longer. So, I mean, this is one of the ways to move. If the speakers agree, is this okay with you, Peggy and Omar? Sort of like, summarize two trends I see in the questions. Mostly people are asking about the speaker's thoughts on how successful it would be for the international community to get the government to a path which is moderate. There are specific questions on women's issues, and as well, why don't we start with these two, and then I'll look up for some more. So if both Peggy and, the question, one of the questions is that would the Taliban turn around? I think both of you have, at least Omar has focused on this issue. Peggy, it would be good to get your views on this. And I would like, and the women's issue comes under that, whether or not the Taliban is going to be changing its policies and get the empowerment of women steadier place.
Thank you very much, Nipa. I think I'll roll into that, one of the specific questions from Robin Collins, which is, how do we distinguish the spoilers like Islamic State from the worst elements of the Taliban? Is it possible to draw out the more moderate Taliban? And I guess I guess the first thing I'd want to say is that, I mean, the entire focus of the United States in its negotiations with the Taliban has been to satisfy itself that the Taliban did commit to and will live up to its promise to the best of its ability to not allow Afghanistan to become a haven for terrorists. And so when we talk about the Taliban, we're talking about from moderate to very conservative elements of the Taliban, but we're not talking about Islamic State. I mean, the point is that the Taliban has promised to not have links, to not associate, to not help extremist elements, Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. And that, you know, that is the focus. It's not only the focus of the United States, it's actually a common focus of the regional players as well, of all the players, Russia, China, they're all, and Iran and India, and they're all concerned about Afghanistan not becoming a haven for terrorists. What I hope they have put into the mix in that concern is that if the more stable, the more well-functioning Afghanistan is, the better chance the Taliban have to keep a lid on, you know, on extremist elements. So there's a direct relationship between helping the Taliban to come to grips with their administrative and governance challenges, and them being able to live up to their promise of not allowing it to become a haven for terrorists. But the point about how to draw out the more moderate Taliban, I mean, what I've been trying to say is, at this stage, the worst possible approach is to make demands that risk the cohesion of the Taliban, and therefore the moderates cannot meet. Far better to try and devise a step-by-step approach that will engage the Taliban, provide some assistance, and this has already started. I mean, we've seen technocratic assistance coming from Qatar and from Turkey, to name two, but this should be extended much more broadly, so that their ability, their capacity to do what we want them ultimately to do, we help build. And therefore we look at, rather than all or nothing demands, we look at step by step. We try and work on an agreed timeline. And that it's very, very important for the West not to lock itself up in its little groups, the G7 or the and issue ultimatums. All of the regional players and the Western countries have a shared interest in the security of Afghanistan, and therefore we should all be working together in Doha to try and work out a plan that the moderate Taliban, putting in the most kind of basic terms, can sell. There are incentives there so they can sell it to the more conservative elements. And, you know, patience is going to be a key. And that doesn't mean early recognition, because recognition, I mean, UN recognition can be something that's held in abeyance. Recognition by, I mean, I think Omar laid out, some countries will take a very practical decision, some of the regional players, and say, you know, we need to start working with them immediately. We're going to recognize them for that purpose. And others will want to hold back on that. Likewise, sanctions. Sanctions are an important area of leverage, but again, it can't be all or nothing. The Taliban have to have some means of and incentives to work towards a position where sanctions can be lifted, and it's the same with respect to women's rights. I mean, if assistance can be given to them in working out a system of segregated education, which is most certainly not what the West would regard as an optimal position, but that's, you know, the point is there, I mean, and there are close allies of the West that have such systems, And therefore, are there practical steps and assistance that can be given to the Taliban so that they can develop a plan that will allow education, the all-important education of high school and university education of women to continue on a segregated basis. And in hospitals, all these other areas where women are working, I have no doubt that non-governmental organizations are already doing this. MSF did a wonderful op-ed where they said, we haven't left Afghanistan and we're not going to leave Afghanistan. We're engaging as we always have with the Taliban, and we'll continue to do so, and on a practical basis. And that has to be our watchword. And just before I stop, I want Nipa to note that there's a question that actually is which is actually your forte, which is Afghanistan needs aid now, but how do you rid Afghanistan of its financial dependency longer term? I mean, my short answer would be, once you get rid of everything being subverted to the war, you can actually start looking at development and following, the kinds of principles and the practical knowledge that you have. So again, I'll stop there.
Well, I don't want to take time from the audience in answering their questions. We should talk. Actually, we should probably have a session organized for this aspect and how the government any government can get the legitimacy and support of the people, which has been lacking actually over the last, in the first half of the decade, it was not going badly, but it went very bad and nobody was listening. So as usual with every other thing, so we have wasted a lot of money. I was thinking that if I could get to this, Omar, if you could comment on these issues a little bit, including perhaps, it would be very interesting to hear you on Afghanistan, Isabel Coder's question on aid and development and dependency. If you could please talk a bit.
Thank you. Before aid and development, on the other question of the spoilers, distinction versus Taliban hardcore or French elements, I think that we can safely assume that the Taliban have both a somewhat fragile structure at some levels, but a very cohesive, maybe leadership structure that at least keeps everything under wraps, even if there are differences of opinion. They have, we need to realize that they have been around for 25 years now, at least. And there are still people asking, who are they? How are they structured? And who calls the shots? And how do they decide? And who's powerful and who isn't? We still do not know enough about them. Maybe from now on we will. As far as the spoilers, yes, there are many spoilers. I have talked about spoilers even before the fall of Kabul. I think there were spoilers within Kabul. I think there were spoilers in the region. I think there are terrorist spoilers. And then there are terrorist cells used by other spoilers. You have a mix of different spoilers that make the situation very, very unsettling. When we talk about ISKP, or we talk about TTP, the Taliban of Pakistan, or we talk about a new outfit from the region, they have gone through their own evolutions over the years. The ISKP of today is not necessarily the ISKP of 6-7 years ago when it emerged in Afghanistan. And how it emerged is a big question. What was it being used for is another big question. I don't want to get into conspiracy theories because I'm not into that, but there are questions that need to be answered over time. Right now, the Taliban, mainstream Taliban, are very much concerned about stability and about cohesiveness and about control. So are the neighbors. One common thread with the neighbors is that they do not anymore want to see instability. I don't think that they consider more war in Afghanistan to their benefit. Maybe at some point, some countries thought that getting the US bogged down in Afghanistan is a good thing. Well, that has ended now. I think that chaos in Afghanistan actually can overflow and impact the neighbors in so many different ways that the neighbors now have a stake in Afghan stability. Now, that's how the Taliban engage and how they calibrate their position towards the region and the neighbors is going to be interesting. But remember, at the end of the day, there are proxy wars going on. There are different conflicts in the region that over the last at least 25, 30 years have impacted Afghanistan, whether it's in the Middle East and to the west of Afghanistan, or whether it's to the east and south of Afghanistan, or even to the north of Afghanistan, whether they are great power rivalries or whether they are regional rivalries, they have impacted Afghanistan. And I think the Taliban are extremely sensitive to that. And there has to be some kind of understanding that we have to limit and we have to contain the proxy war impact that has hurt Afghanistan over the years. How we do it will have to be seen. So it can be also tied to terrorism because, as I said, there are certain terrorist brands that can be used as part of proxy warfare and has been used in the past. So that makes it very complex. About the international community approach, development, as you said, Nipa, on development and aid. Listen, we have 20 years of lessons to learn from. I am a firm believer that we have had best in good practices and we've had worst in bad practices over these past 20 years. In a militaristic environment, right? In a militarized environment. So now that if you take the military part out, as you said, we need to look at Afghanistan from now on. Once there is some type of recognition, some type of engagement and normalcy, we need to really look at what works in Afghanistan and what doesn't. But I am very much against recreating new dependencies. I'm very much for limiting dependencies and limiting them to critical areas, and then let the country develop and grow from the grassroots and organically. Afghanistan can be enriched. You all know the statistics. We have the potential to be a rich agricultural country. We have the potential to generate our own energy and power and even export it. We have the potential underground of so many valuable minerals. So this is a country that has so much potential, which we really, really underestimated or wasted so much over the years. I think the Afghan people from now on deserve to be guided and helped in ways that enable self-sustainable and self-reliant models of development. It may take time, but if we had done this, if we had started with the right models 20 years ago, and I remember those discussions we had 10, 15, 20 years ago in Kabul, what really happened is that, and you all know this, it's at the end of the day, it's who pays the bill that decides. And so it wasn't an Afghan decision, for example, to strategize development and economic growth and private sector growth in one way or the other. At the end of the day, it was the donor, the big donors who decided how things should be done. It wasn't the Afghans, and we need to change that. The Afghans have to be in the driver's seat so they can take responsibility as well for their own country and their own people. So we lost that sovereign right to decide about how to do that. And our leadership was so weak, unfortunately, that they couldn't stand up and say, we want to be the partner, or we want to be in the driver's seat. So that's how I see, and about women's and gender, obviously, I agree with Peggy. I think it's absolutely essential to take it step by step. It's absolutely essential to realize that, unfortunately, we have to go back to a segregated system. But if they can give access to all girls and all young women to have access to education and to teachers, very importantly, to teachers and professors, female teachers and professors, to feel safe and to have a salary and to have a job, then I think we have probably won half the battle. Then we let time take care of the rest of it. So there are solutions that we have to look at, because I think the Taliban are, I think, divided on some of these issues.
Thank you, Omar. Well, I apologize that we could not get in detail to all the questions. There are a large number of questions still that we haven't attended to. But we have come to the end of the time we had set for this webinar, encapsulating in less than 2 hours the complexities and time expanse of several decades of history to which our panelists exposed us. To Ambassador Mason and Samad, I sincerely thank you for bringing your expertise and vast experiences to the table and engaging in such fruitful, constructive, and open exchanges. To the audience, I thank you for attending and contributing your time and knowledge to engage the panel and the audience in general in a very topical issue. Indeed, it is topical. You don't see anything but Afghanistan almost in the newspapers like Washington Post and New York Times. To the attending students, thanks for being here today. I don't know how many students are there. We hope that you have benefited from participating in the session, and this experience will encourage you to go the extra mile to learn from many more events of this nature that CIPS will organize through the academic year. Thank you, speakers, for bringing your expertise to the university community. It is really a very different experience we have had today because of your expertise and experiences. Now let us conclude the session with a round of applause for our speakers. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all.
I wish that we could, our recording will help us to do this. If we could have a transcript published, it would be very useful for everybody because it covered a very wide range of issues about which you read in the papers, but none of them help you to understand as clearly, I thought, as I understood today from both of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nipa. Thank you, Peggy, and everyone in Ottawa.
Thank you
Have a
very
good day.
much.
Bye-bye.
All.
I'll be in touch with you later.